As soon as everybody has a drink and anything else they want, we'll probably get going, all right?
Take advantage.
Yes, please help yourself now. I'll do an introduction right now, and then we'll hear from our Drinan chair. So in 2006, Georgetown Law established the Robert F. Drinan, S.J. Chair in Human Rights. And the position is designed to bring distinguished human rights experts to teach and engage with our community. Father Drinan, who was a professor at Georgetown Law from 1981 until his death in 2007, was a priest, a scholar, a lawyer, a politician, an activist, an ethicist, and one of the nation's leading advocates for international human rights. He dedicated his life to humanitarian causes and to improving the legal profession. He served as a U.S. representative from Massachusetts for 5 terms, from 1971 to 1981, before he came to our law school. A leading voice in the human rights movement for more than a half a century, Father Drinan traveled the globe both as a member of Congress and as a private citizen on human rights missions to, listen to the range, Vietnam, Thailand, Hong Kong, China, Japan, the Netherlands, South Africa, Sudan, Israel, the former Soviet Union, Chile, the Philippines, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Argentina. And of course, Father Drinan taught classes on international human rights here at Georgetown. Among the 12 books that he authored is one entitled The Mobilization of Shame, A World View of Human Rights. We're honored this year to have Francois Crépeau as the 2016-17 Robert F. Drinan, S.J. Chair in Human Rights. Professor Crépeau currently serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants and as a full professor at the McGill University Faculty of Law, where he holds the Hans and Tamar Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law and directs the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. While at Georgetown this fall, Professor Crépeau is teaching a practicum course on international mobility, migration mobility, and human rights, and I know a number of his students are here today. Since his appointment in 2011 as the UN Special Rapporteur, Professor Crépeau has produced several thematic reports on a range of very important issues, including the detention of migrants, the protection of migrants' rights at the external borders of the European Union, climate change and migration, global migration governance, which is the topic he'll be talking about particularly today, labor exploitation of migrants, and labor recruitment practices. In this role, advising the UN Human Rights Council, he has conducted official visits to, among others, Albania, Tunisia, Turkey, Italy, Greece, Qatar, Sri Lanka, Malta, Brussels, Vienna, and Australia. I guess Brussels will fill in for Belgium, huh? Today he will talk to us about global migration governance after the New York summit, which recently occurred. Towards a generational agenda is his question. Professor Crépeau, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy, for the generous presentation. It's an honor to be in Georgetown, and it's an honor to having been appointed to a chair in the name of Father Drinan. I mean, these are big shoes to fill, even if it's for a short time. Today I'll present a few ideas coming from the experience of my UN mandate since 2011, and coming from the recent flurry of international activity around migration. And as I've been explaining to my students, it's very recent. It's basically 6 years old. Before that, there was very little international debates on global migration governance, apart from the refugee issue. I'll start by recalling a few points I made last year in this university for the DASH conference in order to set the stage, and I'll then move on to what may happen in the near future and hopefully in the longer term. My first point, I should move to the outline. My first point, that's the only slide you'll see. So, my first point is that migrants are not represented in our electoral democracies. We don't know how to represent migrants. Human rights struggles have historically mostly been won based on the political claim to equal citizenship. Industrial workers, women, Aboriginals, detainees, gays and lesbians, to name only a few, know that. When they started to play a meaningful role at political level, often because they had wrenched the ability to do so from the hands of the powers that be, politicians started to pay attention and changed their language, their behavior, their conceptions, in turn altering the perceptions of the electorate. This is not happening anytime soon for migrants. The right to vote and be elected is reserved, even in international human rights law, to citizens. We're facing here a structural limit of electoral democracy. If one is not represented, one's rights are not respected, protected, or promoted in the political system. No taxation without representation, said the American Revolution. Most migrants respect the law and pay taxes, and yet aren't represented. In Switzerland, it's 24% of the population who are not represented while paying taxes. Nationalist populist politicians, as we all know in this city, established the dominant narrative, saying that migrants steal jobs, create insecurity, change our values, all assertions that have been proven wrong by social science, with total impunity. Mainstream politicians are not taking the electoral risk of picking a fight in favor of persons who are politically non-existent. With the exception, I would say, with a partial exception, of this country, because of the size of the 30 million strong Hispanic electorate, people who vote. So there's an important objective here, and I think the Republicans have felt that they have missed an opportunity in the past two electoral cycles, and maybe in this one as well. We'll see. In effect, in most countries, there's no coherent, sophisticated, positive narrative on migrants, on mobility, on diversity, which mainstream politicians left and right could use to win elections. And I fear that Europe will have to endure a stretch of nationalist populist governments, either in coalition or outright majority governments, whose brutal policies will miserably fail before Europeans realize that they need a different approach to mobility and diversity. Failure of deterrence and prohibition policies. Migrants move due to push and pull factors. The push factors are well known. The pull factors are much less discussed. All migrants, including refugees, mostly try to go where there are jobs, where they can start integrating, creating a future for themselves and their children. Destination countries have jobs for migrants in the official labor market or in the underground labor markets of dynamic, open, and diverse cities around the world. A considerable number of employers are actually calling for more exploitable migrants to fill their cheap labor needs. Migrants are responding to the opportunities of such labor markets and would not come otherwise. Now, if you have push and pull factors and you put a barrier between them, prohibiting mobility but responding neither to the need to hire or the need to leave, you create perfect conditions for underground labor markets and underground smuggling markets to flourish. Without regular migration channels for refugees and much needed low-wage migrants migrant workers, prohibitions and repressive policies only entrench smuggling operations and underground labor markets. We are subsidizing the smugglers, which is pretty ridiculous if we think of it. Prohibition is part of the problem, not of the solution. This was the case for the prohibition era in this country, when it took American authorities 13 years to figure out that legalization, regulation, and taxation of alcohol was a much more cost-effective and life-saving policy than prohibition. We are slowly going in the same direction in the present war on drugs, thanks to safe injection sites and the legalization of marijuana. On migration issues, as for the regulation of drugs and alcohol, we must choose the path of harm reduction policies rather than that of zero tolerance policies. We know Einstein's definition of insanity, and we need to increase the legalization, regulation, and taxation of mobility. The only way to actually reduce smuggling and unethical recruiting is to take over the mobility market from the hands of the smugglers and exploitative recruiters by offering regular, safe, accessible, and affordable mobility solutions in the form of visas or visa-free travel opportunities with all the identity and security checks that efficient visa regimes can provide. Externalization won't work in the long run. It doesn't respond to mobility needs and labor market shortages. The premise that transit countries will voluntarily create a migration problem for themselves in order to help richer countries responsible for attracting those migrants to their labor markets in the first place hasn't proven workable until now, unless geography helps. That's the only blip. The EU-Turkey statement fails to convince and has increased considerably the number of deaths at sea since last March. The Australian model of stopping the boats through utterly violating the rights of thousands of migrants in the hope of deterring many others isn't a long-term solution either. It violates the principle at the root of all international human rights law, a principle that Father Drinan would have known very well, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Never treat the other only as a means, but always also as an end. The Australian policy is only possible in the absence of constitutional human rights guarantees which would allow the judiciary to evaluate immigration policies and practices. So we need to change tack. And this is where developing a long-term strategic mobility policy vision is important. The global north has the capacity to integrate millions of migrants and refugees. And when I say the global north, we may add to that middle-income countries, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. Ken Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch, said, "If there is a crisis, it's one of politics, not of capacity. Due to the representation deficit, we are facing a crisis of moral and political leadership." That's the crisis, not a crisis of numbers. Unfortunately, one cannot get out of a crisis unless one provides a post-crisis vision, a convincing narrative. There will be no tackling the present migration crisis in Europe and elsewhere until politicians delineate a long-term, human rights-based, strategic mobility and diversity policy vision that will give meaning, coherence, and direction to the actions presently taken. We need to change our collective mindset and accept that migrants will come no matter what, because of push and pull factors, because we need them, because our employers are calling for them. The goal is to have most migrants using official channels to enter and stay in host countries. That's what we all want. Two axes will be key, which I had developed last year in the DASH conference, and I won't come back on those. Developing refugee resettlement programs to serve considerably more refugees than the present less than 1%. And private sponsorship, the Canadian claim to fame in recent years, will be part of that, but also recognizing our own labor needs at all scale levels and opening up considerably more visa opportunities or visa-free travel programs for low-wage workers. With proper selection, the numbers would be entirely manageable. After the 2005 EU enlargement, 1.5 million Central Europeans came to the UK and Ireland. These are very small territories, and made a great economic contribution. When the crisis struck in 2009, many left the UK. Between a quarter and a third of them left. This is a mobility to celebrate. It matches labor needs and individual skills. We should want it not only between cities of our countries, we want it between Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, between Detroit, Los Angeles, Chicago. But we should also want it between our countries and planet-wide as a longer-term objective. Such facilitated mobility has obvious advantages. It reduces significantly the market for smugglers. It allows for all the security checks by intelligence agencies to be made abroad. It reduces considerably the workload of the refugee status determination system in our countries. Most importantly, it provides the opportunity to show the electorate of destination countries that borders are respected, authorities are managing this migration properly, there's no chaos on the beach, reception mechanisms are in place, employers are integrating migrants in the labor market, investments have been made in integration programs, and that the fear-mongering discourse of nationalist populist politicians is based on stereotypes, myths, and fantasies. We can show that if we put in place the proper policies. This type of mobility is not science fiction. In the 50s and 60s, millions of Turks and North Africans entered Europe without a visa or with an easily obtainable visitor's visa that they would change into a work permit as soon as they found a job. There was no market for smuggling. No one died in the Mediterranean. IDs and travel documents were checked at every single border. There was no freedom of movement at the time. So the idea is not to diminish border controls. On the contrary, it's to increase them and make them more effective by offering most foreigners easier access to appropriate travel documents such as refugee resettlement visa, visitor visa, family reunification visa, work visa, resident visa, student visa, etc. We allow states to concentrate their intelligence and deterrence efforts on the minute percentage of foreigners who really need to be excluded. And we can set ourselves the goal of achieving this mobility within a generation. That's the idea of the generational agenda. Say a quarter century, say a half century, that's 2 generations. Through the progressive expansion of visa liberalization and visa facilitation regimes, and we could establish benchmarks along the way. Such a strategy will also command long-term investments in diversity and integration policies, education strategies, providing migrants with tools of empowerment, access to justice, support for the fight against marginalization and discrimination that fuel disenfranchisement. And this is not a utopian solution. I think the New York Declaration is the first step that we take collectively in that direction. I would argue that utopia, or dystopia, is on the side of those who proclaim that migration can be stopped, that we can continue to live peacefully with millions of disenfranchised migrant youths, or that we can deport millions of migrants and seal the borders with fences and walls while respecting human rights. That's utopia or dystopia. Responding to the complexity of human mobility, states will need to develop a long-term strategic vision of how their mobility policies will look like in a generation from now, with timelines, accountability benchmarks. States do this strategic planning for energy, environmental, infrastructure, public transit, industrial policies. We do it all the time. In the UK, you have foresight reports on all those issues for the next 20, 40, or 60 years. Why not do it for mobility and migration policies? What we see at the moment is that most governments are in the present mode. Let's stop migration now. And to me, that's very problematic. In Target 10.7 of Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, states have agreed to, and I quote, facilitate, end of quote, migration and mobility for the next 15 years. Now, if you take the dictionary, facilitating means making migration easier, lowering the barriers to mobility. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And it's in Agenda 2030. It doesn't mean open borders or absolute free movement. It means developing many more creative visa avenues for all migrants and refugees. On the 19th of September 2016, a few weeks ago, the UN General Assembly high-level plenary meeting on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants adopted the New York Declaration. It's a huge document, saying everything but committing nothing. But that's how the UN works, and it's a step forward. We have to take that into account. Despite manifest flaws, it establishes a 2-year process leading to an international conference that will see the adoption in the fall of 2018 of 2 global compacts, one on refugees, one on migration. This opportunity should be seized by states and all other stakeholders to ensure that the global compacts are not the end of the process, because it won't be, but rather its beginning. And one could imagine, and that's sort of what I'm suggesting, states agreeing in the Global Compact on Migration to initiate a 15-year agenda parallel to the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, which would include successive benchmarks and accountability mechanisms. Such an agenda would be punctuated by the annual meetings of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and a series of UN General Assembly high-level dialogues. We've already had 2, one in 2006, one in 2013. And we could say that, we could have them every 5 years to ensure that the implementation of the agenda stays on course. As such an agenda will start in 2018, we could call it, that's my suggestions for what it's worth, the 2033 Agenda on Sustainable Human Mobility. The content of the agenda remains to be determined. Several chapters will be needed, and one can enumerate short-term visits, job search, student mobility, intra-firm mobility, retiree mobility, business creation mobility, family reunification, family sponsorship, long-term residence, access to citizenship, etc., etc. The sticking points in the negotiation of the agenda can also be enumerated and will mostly concern low-wage workers. Increasing the number of short-term visitor visas, allowing easy family reunification for all. Think of temporary migrant workers who are not allowed to bring family members. Allowing students to remain and take up jobs in the country where they studied. It's often the case in countries like the US and Canada, but not always the case elsewhere. Allowing access to permanent residence after a reasonable time of effective residence under any temporary migration regime. Allowing access to citizenship after a reasonable time of permanent residence, considerably reducing underground labor markets. That will be difficult. Ensuring that migrants' rights are central in each and every visa regime. Not done now. Incorporating in national narratives, especially at constitutional level, the celebration of diversity as an asset for innovation, prosperity, and development. Not really popular in many countries in the world. So let's take them one by one and see what we could do. Multiplying the number of visa opportunities will not come easily to many countries. The EU model of negotiating visa facilitation and visa liberalization agreements with other countries could be used. That's a good model. Fortunately, it often comes with with considerable strings attached. What One could imagine that by 2033, let's dream a bit, all states would have visa facilitation agreements with all their neighboring states and would have visa liberalization with many of them. In 15 years, it could be achievable. Such agreements would cover visitors' visas, work visas. Using a visitor visa for job searching should not be discouraged. To the contrary, this would be one way that would allow employers to meet candidates for the jobs offered. Second issue, family unity. I think this is something that will resonate in the future. It should become a key principle to be implemented by all states. The idea that migrant workers can live years, sometimes decades, far from their family should be utterly challenged. Any migrant worker effectively staying at least, let's say, 6 months in the country of destination, whatever the duration of the visa, should be able to bring their family to live with them. And that should be recognized as a human right. It may not have been a key human right principle immediately after World War II, but the human rights doctrine has evolved, and this should now be considered a priority, if only for the sake of the children. Another point is reducing considerably underground labor markets will be difficult. The situation is that employers in low profit margin economic sectors are happy with employing cheap labor to reduce their costs. Consumers are happy that the price of goods so produced remains low. The authorities are happy that such businesses are profitable and able to pay taxes, and migrants in a precarious situation do not complain for fear of detection, detention, and deportation. So where's the problem? Yet, reducing considerably underground labor markets is key to achieving effective mobility without distortions, as it will mean that migrants will not be able to live in the shadows of society in a state of exploitation. They will do as citizens do in this country, in my country. You try to find a job, my country, you can't find a job in Montreal, you go to Toronto. You live in Toronto for a month looking for a job, going from employer to employer. Can't find anything, well, you move to Vancouver or Calgary until you find something. Access to permanent residence or long-term residence permits should be allowed after a reasonable time of effective residence under any temporary regime. I would personally choose 5 or 6 years of effective residence as the benchmark, but that can be discussed. This would imply repealing all the rules that effectively prevent this to happen, such as the Canadian 4x4 rule, which says that if you come as a temporary migrant worker for 4 years, you have to stay out of the country for the next 4 years, and then you can come back, which is designed to prevent people from accessing any type of permanent residence. If the temporary worker has a job, pays taxes, and if the employer is happy with her, why would you exclude her? It's as if our countries had been shaped only by highly skilled migrants. That's not the story of my family. That's probably not the story of many families in this room. Access to citizenship will be difficult as well for a number of countries who have an ethnic or cultural conception of citizenship. But after 5 or 6 years of permanent residence, which can follow 5 or 6 years of temporary migrant worker status, paying taxes, committing no crime, migrants should be allowed to integrate fully. This would implement the principle no taxation without representation. That's the idea. Migrants' rights and labor rights should be front and center in this process. Labor exploitation needs to be reduced. One cannot tolerate that whole sectors of national economies only survive thanks to cheap labor. Sorry, this is turned off. Yeah. Thanks to cheap labor. Competitiveness, productivity, innovation requires guarantees for workers. The sponsorship system for temporary migrant workers, called the kafala system in the Gulf states, tying the work visa to one employer, should be eliminated. There's growing acceptance of this idea in favor of an open work visa, allowing the worker to move on the labor market as any other worker, responding to demand and offer of jobs. Labor inspections should focus on implementing labor conditions for all workers, regardless of status, and not focus on trying to identify undocumented migrant workers. Employers of undocumented migrants need to be denounced and punished appropriately, not the undocumented migrant workers themselves. Punishing the workers pushes them deeper into the underground, where they are effectively silenced and thus vulnerable to more exploitation. Punishing the employer increases the cost of cheap labor, thus providing an effective disincentive. That's what we need to do. And migrants need to be empowered to defend their rights. Unionization of migrant workers, regardless of status, should be encouraged. Access to justice should be facilitated. These are all issues which will need to be in the agenda, if not this one, the next one. Incorporating diversity into national narratives will also face resistance, especially in countries with a long history of discrimination against minorities, indigenous peoples, or foreigners. It should, however, be an objective of such a 2033 agenda to have it recognized that almost all countries are nowadays countries of origin, transit, and destination. All diversities should be concerned: ethnic, language, religion, culture, gender, age, status. With mobility now recognized as key to prosperity, diversity should be recognized as key to sustainability. Mobility as a development factor is not sustainable if diversity is not recognized as well. Mobility across borders and integration in host societies are coextensive. So we need to negotiate a small but focused number of critical ideas. All this could be part of the 2033 agenda, but considering the reticence of states, it is certain that not all of this will be, or would be. Should be more cautious, I suppose. However, if we could agree on a modest proportion of increased mobility and diversity, we will have made progress and paved the way for future advances. We should remember that despite their flaws, the Millennium Development Goals adopted in 2000 were instrumental in alleviating poverty and exclusion between 2000 and 2015. And that based on that experience, we have committed to a more ambitious program of sustainable development goals for the 2015-2030 period. Well, this is the type of progress we want to make with mobility as well. In the same way, I suggest that we agree on a small number of measures that would facilitate mobility and strengthen the recognition of diversity around the world in the coming 15 years. The negotiation of this global compact of migration offers us an opportunity. In conclusion, I'd like to highlight a number of silver linings because we feel doomed in our little milieu of migration and mobility experts because of the kind of rhetoric that we hear constantly here and elsewhere. But there are silver linings showing that the changing narrative is already underway. Artists, such as film directors, novelists, have, as always, anticipated our mobility and diversity dilemma, and they help us to process the changes. You look at the books published on migration in the past 5 to 10 years, and it's extraordinary. NGOs, churches, unions, lawyers, universities are everywhere doing a great job in trying to protect individual migrants and alter public perceptions. Courts, tribunals, national human rights institutions, ombudspersons are often coming down on the side of migrants, reminding everyone that migrants are rights holders and should benefit from the rule of law. We learned yesterday that the Supreme Court will study the case of this suit by Mexican parents for the killing of their son, who received the bullet in Mexico, which was fired by a border guard in the US. It's very good that the Supreme Court has accepted to hear the case. That's very good. We'll see what the result will be. But we've seen in many crucial cases, important courts, European courts of human rights, Canadian Supreme Court, etc., doing the right thing in the past years. Journalists in serious media outlets are much better educated today than only 5 to 10 years ago. They've gone to Lampedusa, they've gone to Idomeni, they've gone to see how Rohingya refugees were faring. They're doing excellent investigative journalism. And their stories help a new narrative to emerge. The business community knows very well that mobility and diversity are huge opportunities in terms of innovation and creativity. They have a congenital fear of sticking their hands in a toxic political grinder they do not control. But they will need to start speaking up and explain how mobility and diversity are key to their business models and need to be mainstreamed. That's the challenge of the British business class now, explaining to Brexiteers that they're wrong and that this will hurt the British economy. Cities around the world have absorbed millions of migrants from the countryside and from abroad. They embrace mobility and diversity without the need of securitizing their borders, while policing their territory. Their dynamism should inspire national migration policies. Youth is much more diverse and mobile than we were at their age. I don't know about you, Andy, but for me, living in Montreal when I was young, going to Ontario was exotic. They share social integration challenges, whatever their background. Hopefully, diversity and mobility policies will come to them naturally, will come to you naturally, when you take charge in 25 to 30 years from now. Just would like to see that happening before. Thousands of citizens have come forward to help individual migrants and families everywhere, in Europe, in Canada, private sponsorship thing in Canada, in Europe. Many Germans have come forward and helped. They do not form a political party like the anti-immigrants groups have formed a political party in Germany, but they have come forward and they have helped, and they're very happy to have done so. And this is something we should work on. And the migrants themselves show an agency, a resilience, a creativity, which is already making an impact on many of the host society citizens they are encountering in their everyday life. Their lives embody the narrative we need. We've seen that in Germany recently, where there was someone who was making bombs somewhere, and he was stopped and arrested by 3 Syrian refugees. This is important. This was very important as an element of the narrative in Germany. Despite the present reticence of states and the toxic political debates, all this tells us that mobility and diversity may be more and more recognized and celebrated as central features of our societies in the coming years. The grand narrative that gives legitimacy to our constitutional, legal, political structures will thus get more sophisticated in the coming years and mesh mobility and diversity with other fundamental values and traits. For sure, the nationalist populist narrative is dominating at present. I hope that through the development of a common agenda for the long period, a post-crisis vision, we can see beyond their fantasies and threats and start preparing for a different, more productive narrative. I thank you. And I'll answer questions with pleasure.
Thank you so much, Francois, for those insightful remarks. So the floor is open. Just, Carlos, go begin. Thanks.
Thank you for an excellent lecture. I just had one question.
Just one?
Well, you seem to equate two phenomena that have traditionally been distinguished, or at least you spoke about them together, and that is refugee protection and migration.
Yep.
And so I wonder, do you view the two as parts of the same phenomenon, or do you think it's better to distinguish the two? And in particular, I wonder if discussing the two phenomena together might potentially lead to a weakening of the protections that refugees get. And is that a concern that you?
Yeah, it's a concern. There are several elements that come into that, into the answer to that preoccupation. One is that people move for multiple reasons. We have defined 65 years ago a refugee status with a definition whereby we have a small number of migrants who are identified as refugees and have a specific protection regime. It's been extremely important for those refugees to have that regime. It has protected millions over the years, and we should keep that. And there is great fear that if we start renegotiating this regime, we'll lose many of the guarantees that it provides. So that's one thing. Now, migrants move for many reasons. It's called mixed flows. And we have different people, sometimes in the same community, sometimes in the same family, who have different motives for moving. What I'm saying is that there is very little problem to protect refugees and other migrants when borders are open. But when we want to close borders, as we've done in this country, in my country, in Europe, in many other countries in the rest of the world, well, suddenly we have a problem, because suddenly we have to create a huge administration to be able to distinguish who is a refugee, who is not, and how and why. What I'm trying to convey is that we would do ourselves a favor by facilitating mobility for all of those. And so that's why I talked last year at the DASH conference of two particularly important programs. One would be refugee resettlement, having real refugee resettlement programs. At present, refugee resettlement is less than 1% of all, is a solution for less than 1% of the refugees of the world. And that's not enough. Many of them have been in a refugee situation for over 20 years, some for over 50 years. This is intractable. These are called protracted refugee situations. We need to move these people. And we need to move them not necessarily because they've been refugee for a long time. If Europe had started to move refugees from Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey in 2012, 2013, in sufficient numbers, telling people, okay, we'll move you out of those countries, we'll find something to help you, we'll provide you with something. Come to the Danish booth, come to the Dutch booth, come to the British booth, and we'll list you your number 2051, and we'll take up your case, we'll study, and we'll see whether we can relocate you in our country. As we did for 3 million Indo-Chinese, as we did for the Hungarians in 56, or the Czechs in 68, Chileans with less enthusiasm in 73, 74. There would not have been the same crisis over the Mediterranean. We wouldn't have 3,000, 4,000 deaths at sea. People would wait in line because a solution would be coming. So what I'm saying is that mobility in all its forms, including refugee status, but many people may not qualify as refugees, but would qualify for what Europeans call subsidiary protection. Thank you, Andy. For subsidiary protection, we can use, if we proactively use this to to bring them in, we're going to save ourselves a lot of hassles at political level, because we'll show that we can actually manage this. At present, they come crashing on the beaches, and that's what the nationalist populists are preying on. So I'm not saying that we should suppress the distinction. There are many different categories of immigration. Family reunification. When you have all those undocumented children trying to cross Mexico to come to the US to join a family member. Well, if we made family unity a basic principle of human rights and decided to do something about it, if Europeans did that for refugees from Africa and Asia, which they're not doing, despite the fact that it is in the Dublin III regulation, that they have the possibility of accelerating all procedures in order to reunite families, but they're not using it. They're simply, it's not happening in practice. Well, they would save themselves a lot of hassle. These kids would not be lingering in Calais or elsewhere. And so to me, that is very important, to recognize that there are many categories of people with many categories of needs, and that we can proactively manage, organize, govern this if we want to, but we don't.
Thank you. Two questions. So to keep you happy, I'm happy to do. There is, as you yourself said, there is quite a stark difference between the very sort of convincing, rational agenda that you're proposing for managing migration with the very nativistic, populist, tribalistic, fear-fueled rhetoric that we see in so many places. You haven't mentioned also the big scare in many Western and Central European countries of this wave of Muslim migrants that are taking over Christian countries, not assimilating, representing potential reservoir of terrorism. So how, if you had a bully pulpit, if you were the Gutierrez on 2nd of January 2017, how would you bridge the divide? What would you do to start changing the narrative? Because it seems that rational arguments don't always penetrate that kind of narrative. The second question is, what about codes of conduct for migration? The field I'm familiar with, public health, there are several codes of practice, codes of conduct on movement of health personnel. That's a very specific field. These are pull factors because there is a demand for doctors and nurses. But it does introduce an element of regulation, an element of fairness, some guarantees for the migrants or in terms of labor rights and so on. It introduces a modicum of accountability because there are some reporting requirements, for example, in the WHO code that was adopted in 2010. So, do you see this as a possible model?
So second question is easier. Second question, yes, absolutely. All the tools that we can get. Certainly, measures of accountability are key. What we are having now is a system where we create precariousness, either in underground labor markets, which we're happy with. We're not fighting them, really. We have delocalized all the industries that needed to be delocalized to lower the labor costs and could be delocalized, like making chips. And for those industries that could not be delocalized, like agriculture, fisheries, or mining, or whatever, we have delocalized working conditions of the South by tolerating underground labor markets. So and those underground labor markets, or in the case of temporary migrant workers, the precariousness of temporary migrant statuses, in many countries, their documentation and travel documents are being confiscated. The contract they agree to in their own country is not the contract that they end up with when they arrive in the country of destination. They have huge debts. Recruiters are not ethical recruiters. Many recruiters are not ethical recruiters, and et cetera, et cetera. Not even talking about the abuse that domestic workers or construction workers are suffering everywhere. So if we could have mechanisms, which would be branch mechanisms like health workers, but other workers. This is slowly happening. Qatar has announced last week, that they were improving considerably the law, and that's the law. We'll see about the practice when the law comes into force. But migrant workers will be able to change employer. Migrant workers, it will be again forbidden to confiscate travel documents. It was like that, so we'll see if the practice follows. But they have, there will be no necessity of no objection certificate by the employer before they can leave the country. So these are, major changes. That creates, because this reduces the precariousness, that reduces the fact that migrants are being silenced by the precariousness, by the fear of being sent back home packing without anything. which is the destruction of the whole migration project in which they have invested so much. So it will allow them to speak up. It's not yet freedom of assembly and unionization in Qatar. These are still taboo words. But it's one step forward towards better accountability. So answer to your question, yes, that's a model. That's something that can be used. It will probably not be very popular in many quarters, but it's important that we have this kind of experience. Your first question was more complicated. And I think, what does Mr. Guterres do on the 1st of January in terms of changing the narrative? That's what we're all talking about. How do you change the narrative? And I think that one element of answer has been given by the Canadian experience of private sponsorship. The Minister McCallum, the Minister of Immigration of Canada, said, arriving at the 19th of September summit in New York, I'm the only Minister of Immigration who cannot provide enough refugees to his population. And to me, this is key. There's no party in favor of migration in Canada, but you have thousands and thousands of Canadians who have applied to get a refugee. This is goodwill incarnate. These people show that they're doing something. They're not bragging about it. They're not, creating a party. But collectively, they sent out a message to the country. I'm doing something. What are you doing? And this is, to me, the best answer to the nationalist populists. To show these people that there's at least an equal number of people who will go the other way. And so that they cannot dominate the agenda. I know that several countries, including Germany, have come to Canada to study the mechanism, and that UNHCR is very interested and would like to transfer. The George Soros has set aside, I don't remember the exact number, $65 million or something like that, in order to help countries adopt the mechanism of private sponsorship of refugees. If you let the people in the street decide for themselves, you're not in the situation which the populists love, of having the elite in the capital of the city telling the populists, you're wrong, your facts are wrong. The populists love that because they have other facts, and so it's not the leaders, it's not the elite, it's not the intelligentsia that's telling them. It's ordinary people getting together and doing something right. And so I think that is the kind of thing that we must encourage, and that will, and if we can do that for ordinary people, if we can have unions coming on board. At international level, union federations are on board. At national level, in many countries, federations are on board. At local level, migrant workers, undocumented migrant workers, are still considered as competition for the members. This is changing because unions are in bad shape in many countries, and suddenly there's this potential new membership that could come, and a membership which is in the exact same exploitative position as industrial workers in the 19th century. That's their natural pool of members. And I think that unions will do that. And if we can get, the unions, the churches, etc. Churches are very good in Canada for private sponsorship. Congregations have encouraged and have facilitated the private sponsorship by their members, by providing support, expertise, etc. So we can there's goodwill out there. And we have to mobilize that in favor of creating a different narrative. But it's not very satisfactory in the short term. That will only work in the long term for 10, 15, 20 years.
Okay.
I was going to ask first, kind of to go on what you were saying, how do you get around this dialogue of people that are sort of, just the idea of permanent migration seems to be something that's kind of a deal breaker. So even if people are on board for something temporary, it seems like permanent is what's scary? And you just sort of answered that, but I don't know if you could go into a little bit more depth. And then secondly, we kind of talked about this in class, but just to make it complicated and bring it up again, who would be pushing this through? And I think it has, ideally it's at the state level, but a number of states would have to sort of do something like the practical plan that you've laid out sort of simultaneously for it to be effective, I think, or at least on a regional basis. So I guess that's the big question.
Yeah, yeah. Easy questions, too. Yeah, thank you. It will be difficult for a number of societies to accept that they will be demographically changed permanently. We see that, for example, very vividly in Denmark. I was reading, I think yesterday, about a TV show that happened a few weeks ago where a young man of 20 or 22, if I'm not mistaken, and I may have the facts not exactly right, but Danish mother and Afghani father, born in Denmark, discussing on TV with the head of the Nationalist Populist Party there, and saying, well, you know, I was born here, I'm fully Danish, etc. And the head of the party answering, no, you're not. You're not Danish. That's not how someone becomes Danish. One is Danish because one has lived in this country for many generations. This could not be said 5-10 years ago. Now it's being said. So I think that is a reaction. My silver lining, again, is that I have the feeling, but maybe it's the half-full glass instead of the half-empty glass. I have the feeling that this is a swan song. I have the feeling that this objection to multiple identities, multiple allegiances, is more strident today because it's more and more evident that this is what's going to happen in the future. And this is what is happening already now. And I think the resistance is much harder now because they see it all around them happening. And they know that 20 years from now, hopefully, their take on who is Danish and who is not will look like, you know, so 20th century, you know? And I think that there is, to me, so that's where I'm a bit optimistic, especially optimistic with your generation, who has a completely different take on diversity. You're very diverse anyway. You've had kids, I mean, when I had, just to give a personal example, I think I gave it in class, when I was young, having a black person as another student in my school, that would have been the first thing I would have told my parents. You know, he's black. My kids are going to school, and I'd hear about Simone for 6 months before discovering that she's black. It's never been mentioned by my kids. It's not something, or they will say, that happened to me at the annual show for the school, and I asked my daughter, who's 9 now, she was 8, who was her professor, and she said, it's the black lady over there. And I said, there's no black lady. Yes, the lady with the black dress. That's her definition of a black lady. I mean, it's a different mode. And I think that many, not all, unfortunately, but many in cities today have a very different experience of diversity than we had 50 years ago. So that's my first question. Your second question was, who would push the agenda? Can you repeat the question so I reinterpret it?
Yeah, just who do you see as sort of leading this conversation, the 2023 agenda? Like, who would?
At one point, my answer, at one point, mainstream political actors, politicians, will need to find something to answer the nationalist populists. For the moment, the best thing we can expect from them is to remain silent. In France at the moment, there is a primary on the right with Sarkozy and Juppé. And Sarkozy is all in favor of stopping migrants and deterring people. And, and Juppé is silent, doesn't say a thing. That's the best you can expect. You have people like Angela Merkel who've done a significant move forward and are paying for it. But she's very silent on integration, on other stuff. She's very silent. They are doing lots of things, but they're not developing a narrative because they will pay for it. So at one point, all those politicians, left and right, will need to develop a narrative if they want to win elections, especially if Europe goes in this death spiral of having far-right governments or coalition governments with the far right inside the coalition, having the Ministry of Immigration or Home Affairs or whatever. They will need to develop something against that. And I think the impetus will come from them. They will want to do something. At the moment, they're so scared. They're like, rabbits on the road at night with the glare. They're staying there waiting for something to happen. But at one point they will. And we, citizens, can provide them, academics, citizens, unions, ordinary people doing some private sponsorship. We can provide them with a narrative, but we have to get together. So certainly, lawyers, NGOs have to continue to work. I mean, we can't stop. We have to continue, but we have to create the narrative. And the best way to do this is to enlarge the basin of people who are actually doing something. And I think private sponsorship is one element that could be thrown into that, but there are other unions could be. I'm very encouraged by the press, by the media. I think that there we can see a major change within a decade as to how migrants and refugees are being portrayed. I'm not talking about the yellow press. The yellow press will remain the yellow press. But major media are now interested. They have immigration correspondents. It's brand new.
For your talk, and a lot of what you said resonated with me because I think Hungary, where I'm from, well, is a good case study for that the securitization agenda is that us volunteer citizens work in the shadow of not only the condemnation of our government and being treated as outlaws for providing the social services that arguably the governing authority should have been providing, but also in the shadow of the illegal traffickers, smugglers, etc., not to mention other criminal organizations, basically working side by side the streets with us. And we knew exactly where they were, the police knew exactly where they were. Yeah. And yet nothing happened. But we are the ones defending Christian Europe by constructing a border fence. So this fallacy of if we just violate human rights long enough and make it hard enough, we're going to keep ourselves safe. Well, the reverse is true. But the discourse is extremely difficult. And the truth that we there now hold self-evident in the Central Eastern European region, arguably it's gaining ground. The negative sentiments towards immigration in Europe are very different than the truth that are self-evident here. So that's just a comment. I wanted to pick your mind a bit on family unification. That comes to my research. I work mainly on separation of parents and children in the context of labor migration, circular migration, mostly care work. So you seem to emphasize the right to reunite with family members, possibly obviously in the host country or the country of the productive work. A lot of the cases that I deal with, and a lot of the stories that I deal with, have to do with sectors of the labor market that actively disincentivize that kind of cohabiting family unit idea. And arguably, the family unit has changed and has transnationalized. So reproductive care work is being taken care of in one area so that the mother can leave and work and send money home in the other area. Cohabitation isn't necessarily the ideal for all sectors, large sectors of migrants. I just wanted to sort of get your insights on. I have difficulty finding a rephrased version of the right to family life that would embrace families that don't necessarily want to cohabit in this classic structure, but would appreciate visitation arrangements, facilitation of that, if better facilitation of remittance sending and all of that. So that this sort of equating the right to family unity and life with this notion of the spatially cohabiting, situated family, I think reality has outgrown that, and I wasn't sure if I was getting that from your insights. So honoring this new form of family life, where there is a long-term separation, but it could be mitigated. The harms of it could be made less by rethinking sort of what family unity means in the era of mobility. And I was wondering if there's any higher level discussion. The EU is kind of getting onto this idea of transnational families, but I don't see a lot of good work on it. So I'm sort of in a vacuum with this.
I think you're totally right. What is important is that people have options, is that people have the opportunity to decide for themselves. I mean, that's what dignity is all about, making choices for oneself and not having choices made by others. That's one definition, at least, of dignity. To me, no one should be forced to live with one's family. Sometimes much better not to. and I mean, you're totally right. I mean, a number of people I've met who've left Sri Lanka, for example, or Nepal to go as domestic workers have left because of an abusive environment at home as well, not simply helping the kids to grow by having enough money to put them through school, but also leaving an environment that they detested. So the idea is, to me, to recognize that access to family in whatever format should be a possibility all the time, should people choose that way, make that choice. What we have is temporary migrant worker programs which prohibit presence of family members. And that, to me, is unacceptable in the 21st century. Not that it'll be easy for people to gather the money to bring the family in, not that it'll be easy, etc., but we should provide them with the opportunity. Now, this is precisely what countries like the Gulf states don't want. When you go to Qatar, and you have in Qatar 250,000 Qataris and 2 million temporary migrant workers, they don't want the families of the construction workers to come, because that will bring the number of the temporary migrant workers to 3 million, and they will be less than 5% of the population as citizens, which will, make them ask the question, okay, whose country is it? And they're already very scared of a Spartacus-type response of all the temporary migrant workers they have. So it's not going to come easily. As you say, I think Europe is making strides thanks to courts, which are affirming rights on the part of migrants and not seeing why foreigners should be distinguished from citizens on a number of fundamental rights. So I think that there is progress, and we are now recognizing that living with one's family as a choice should be respected. We're getting there slowly. It was not part of the Human Rights Charter at the UN, really, but it's coming in. It's slowly getting ground, and we are, the Convention on the Rights of the Child made great progress on that, protecting the children, allowing them to be with both parents, etc. So I think that we should go in that direction. Certainly, child protection agencies in many countries are pleading for a much greater role. We too often see unaccompanied minors not being given or not being protected by child protection agencies, staying within the ambit of the immigration department or the police. I mean, in Greece, where I was in last December, undocumented adolescents are actually in what is called over there protective custody, i.e. they are in police station cells, and I've visited a few. And they're there because, otherwise they could be preyed upon by traffickers. Yes, but in the meantime, they're in a cell 24/7 with no window, no access to any courtyard. There's no courtyard in a police station. Nothing. No education, nothing, for weeks or months on end. And so we'll have to change our mindset on that. All these children should be cared for by specialized personnel in charge of the protection of children. And we should open up and train our child protection agencies to care for them. I mean, this is the kind, and open up possibilities for family reunification. The fact that in the EU, Dublin 3 says that families should be reunited, and if there's an undocumented child somewhere, that person should, but we see what's happening in Calais. It's not happening. Now, Britain is not part of Dublin, so that doesn't help, but it's not happening. It's not happening between Greece and Germany. It's not happening between Italy and the Netherlands. It's happening nowhere. I think that's something, to me, which is pretty much a low-hanging fruit. That could be changed. The narrative could be changed. Protecting children is considered extremely important by everyone, and I think we can make progress very quickly on that. But, you know, how will it be? I think the debate here, for example, about all those children coming to the US and being detained, families being detained, is a very good debate. It creates, you know, it makes people think, and suddenly we have lots of people who say, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe there's a, and the fact that it's this president doing, you know, implementing this policy is also cause for discussions and debates. And I think that's progress. It wasn't debated 10, 15 years ago.
2 final questions. Go right ahead.
I guess my question is about kind of the vetting process for when people come in, and that's been an issue at the presidential debates here that I think both candidates support kind of some form of migration and refugees being accepted as long as there's a vetting process to different degrees for the candidates. But with the idea that migration would increase and presumably refugees would be more accepted, how do you kind of reconcile the idea of the vetting of keeping out even a small number of people that would be objective to coming in with the increased number? I think it's kind of the idea that you can have something done, you know, fast, cheap, or right. You can pick any 2, but you can't have all 3. Or is the vetting process kind of not even something that is of overall concern? Is that kind of an unfounded fear in your mind?
It's not a fear. Vetting is something you do when you need to. I find it extraordinary that Canadians, I mean, we have a pretty much mobile relationship with the US, pretty much. When I was young, the only question my parents were asked when we crossed the border from Montreal was, all Canadians? And my parents would say yes, you know, and he would do that, and we would just go through. That was the only question. Nothing else was checked. After 9/11, it became much more difficult. We even have drones on the Canadian border, I'm told. I find it extraordinary that 25 years after NAFTA, we don't have relative free movement. We have free movement for trucks because they have this electronic thing on their windscreen, and they just go through because we think that goods need to go fast. People, not necessarily. And I still have, when I come back from the US, last time I did that by car, I was 4 hours at the border waiting to go through. I find, you know, in the 21st century, between Canada and the US, we shouldn't have that. There are vetting processes. Refugees are the most vetted people in the world. You know, for years, when they are selected abroad, when they're selected in refugee camps. We've done that for 3 million refugees, Indo-Chinese refugees, at the turn of the 70s and the 80s. I mean, we've done that. We can do it. It requires an investment. You have to send people abroad with appropriate training in order to make the appropriate evaluation. But when I think of the European crisis, I don't see why they shouldn't do that. They couldn't do that. Why do they have to do this on a beach in Greece with the fury of the population? Why don't they do it in Jordan, in Lebanon? Install their little booth, plug their computers, put people in a list, give them numbers, and tell them, okay, we've checked your credentials, UNHCR is okay, IOM is okay, you don't seem to have connection to ISIS, so you're in. But we won't be able to take you before another 18 months. But if you wait, you'll get your papers, you'll get your plane ticket, and you come out. People will wait those 18 months. If you don't provide them with a solution, they won't wait. They will take the smuggler anytime. I would too, you would too, probably. So the vetting is key. But we can do it in very different ways. That's why I use the example of the EU, the visa facilitation, visa liberalization process. Albania has a visa facilitation agreement, which means that it's much easier for Albanians now to get a visa to go to the EU and come back and go back and come back. That's what you want. You want people to make choices for themselves, and you go get a visa if you need to. Visa liberalization is you don't need a visa for short-term visits, like Canadians don't need a visa to come to this country. I come, I'm asked if I'm going to work. Sometimes I do. When I come here, I have my J1 visa. I asked for it, but when I only came for the DASH conference last year, I was a visitor. I come without visa. We do that. And my name is taken, the prints are taken. We have the technology, we can do that. And if we can do that, I mean, we can do it for a lot of people. The number of entries into the EU every year is 750 million. So you take out the million of refugees who came into the EU through Greece, and you still have 749 entries. And all these are going through borders with checkpoints, papers, and everything. We do it. We do it all the time. If we have to increase investment to have more people on the ground, more training, let's do that. But increasing mobility while continuing to vet people or to have security checks, it's not a problem. Let's do it. But let's increase mobility. And let's avoid ourselves problems by not vetting people we don't need to vet, like Canadians, for example.